Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
So this morning we welcome Professor Keith Fox, who will mark a change in the emphasis in our program. As you may notice, we've given a good period of time over 2 days to physics, to cosmology, to little green men from other planets, those sort of things. I think they've had their time in the limelight, and so we now move to biology, which of course is a subject near to my own heart. I'm a biochemist by background, like our speaker this morning, who is indeed Professor of the Biological Sciences at the University of Southampton. He's also the chairman of Christians in Science. His research is very much on DNA. If you thought that DNA can only exist as a double helix, then Keith can put you right on that. It can exist as triple helices, and I'm sure many other shapes and forms as well. But we're very pleased to have Professor Fox here and to speak to us on the subject of creation and evolution. So thank you, Keith, very much.
Thank you, Dennis, for your warm welcome, and thank you, everybody, for the privilege of being able to come to the Faraday again. I'm conscious as we switch from the physical to the biological sciences, I'm the warm-up act that can ask all the questions that the rest of the speakers over the next couple of days can address in detail. So ask them the awkward questions rather than me at the end. So we're looking at the whole issue of creation and evolution, and I'm going to take you through some aspects of evolution and then look at the more religious aspects of that as we go through. As Dennis has said, I have the privilege of being the chairman of Christians in Science. So the talk I will give will be from a Christian perspective, but much of what I say will be equally relevant to anybody who comes from any of the other Abrahamic faiths as well. So let's start thinking about this whole aspect of creation for a moment. To some degree, any theist is a creationist. It may be an insult to describe somebody as that, granted all the baggage that comes with that word, creationist. But nonetheless, I go to an Anglican church every Sunday, and we regularly recite the creeds that contain, I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. The word creator in there. And by that we're implying that the creation is distinct from God, it's dependent on God, and it's made somehow from nothing. That's not necessarily creationism as popularly understood of 6 days only 3,000 years ago, but nonetheless it's belief in a creator God. But that leaves us as questions though. How did biological creation occur? And granted it's had occurred, can we detect that creative activity in any way? Are there any signs of a creator left in the biological creation in particular? So what I want to do this morning is to take you through a little bit of what evolution is. I'm conscious that people come from a wide variety of scientific backgrounds. For those of you who are professional biologists, excuse me when I say just a few things about evolution that may be obvious. Some religious responses to evolution and the different ways in which people have and still do react to it. Ask why many religious people feel uncomfortable with that and start to address maybe what are the real issues that underlie some of that. And then finally, if we've got time, to think about whether evolution tells us anything about God and about faith. So at the base of evolution is this whole idea of natural selection, that there is variability, variation in the fitness of various species within the species, and that the organisms struggle to survive. And those that are best adapted to their environment will survive, and their progeny will continue to the next generation. And over many generations the gene pools change, and the fittest are selective, and the less fit do not survive. So it's descent with modification and selection that has shaped the biological world around us. The biological world appears to be designed. Things look as though they're specially fitted to their own niches and their own environment, and that is because of evolution, of selection. Things have been selected to fit with their particular environmental niches, not necessarily that they've been designed to do so. They appear designed because they're adapted for a particular environment through evolutionary processes. So very simply, organisms we know vary a lot, and that those variations are faithfully transmitted from one generation to the next one. All organisms produce more offspring than are required to replace themselves, and there is therefore some competition for the next generation. There's a limited amount of resources. That's something that Malthus really first realized back in the early 19th century. Creatures struggle for existence, regulating the population size, and many offspring die without reproducing. So the fittest ones will reproduce. Individuals that survive and reproduce, of course, on average, by virtue of their fitness, will go on to the next generation, and their properties will propagate, and those that are less fit will disappear with time. If you were to ask the average person what's the evidence for evolution as a mechanism, the man in the street, or man and woman in the street, I suspect the first thing they will come up with is the word fossils. It's all in the rocks, isn't it? Well, actually, I think the fossils themselves, while they're very important for our understanding of evolution, are not at the foundation of it. So Darwin didn't start with fossils. Darwin started with actually observing variations in nature, and particularly not even the finches that he's well known for, but by looking at variations within domesticated animals, so pigeons and doves, and seeing how selection that we can do can influence populations. And looking also at just the standard anatomical and developmental similarities between different organisms, the way in which they're similar to each other and yet different. Darwin was a long time ago, and he made some very fundamental predictions, some very fundamental theories about evolution. But he had very little by means of mechanisms for that. And I think one of the strengths of the whole evolutionary theory is that over the past 150 years, we have discovered more and more of the mechanisms that lie behind evolution. I'm particularly fond of the more biochemical mechanisms because that's my particular background. His theory is now supported by a wealth of evidence, so actually some of the strongest evidence for evolution now doesn't come from the rocks and the fossils, but from studies of genetics and genomics and the whole area of DNA and its structure and the way in which it mutates. And we will deal with that as we move through this morning. So genomics, we know the sequences of many organisms now. The human genome, the first draft of that published in the year 2000. The wonderful thing about us as humans is we are the only species that has sequenced its own genome. But we know that right the way through from bacteria to yeasts to flies to worms to humans to chimpanzees. We know the DNA sequence of that. We know the exact order of those 6 billion base pairs that make up the human genome. And we can now compare the ways in which one species is related to another one. And when we do those comparisons at the molecular level, they end up giving the same evolutionary story, the relatedness between organisms, as is seen at the gross level, at the anatomical level, and is predicted by all the phylogenetic trees. So let me just give you a few examples of this. There are many parts of the human genome, many other genomes, that are used to be called junk. I think junk is not an appropriate word for it now, but we don't know what it does. It's not coding for proteins. It doesn't appear to be functional. And many of those have been inserted randomly, often by viruses. We can talk about the details of that later if you like. And if you look at where those insertions have come amongst different species, you find that the occurrence of those insertions matches very well with what had always been said by looking at the anatomical gross level of the organism. So the molecular actually confirms what we know about the gross levels. Look at one example. Chromosome 2. Chromosome 2 is one of our largest chromosomes. We have 46 chromosomes, 2 copies of 23. Chimpanzees have 48, 2 copies of 24. Now, on evolutionary terms, chimpanzees and us have descended from a common ancestor many millions of years ago, so you'd expect to see some similarities. And when you look at the order of the chromosomes, you find that chimpanzees have chromosomes now that are known as 2A and 2B, whereas we have those that appear to be joined together as one chromosome. Let me go and give you a little bit of the details behind that, of those two. All chromosomes have essentially a middle and two ends. The middle is called a centromere, the ends are called telomeres. So, and there are specific DNA sequences that correspond to those, that we can look for them and explain this is a centromeric region and that's a telomeric region. So, if two chromosomes join together at some stage, you will expect to find the remnants of two centromeres, although it's one chromosome, and the remnants of the original telomere and the middle of a chromosome where you wouldn't normally expect it. And when you look at chromosome 2 in humans, that's exactly what you see. You can see, if you like, the molecular fossils of a telomere in the middle of that chromosome and the molecular fossils of what was a centromere. It does look as though two chromosomes have come together to make one, substantiating the evolutionary idea that chimpanzees and us have a common ancestor. Many other areas of the genome give evidence that they were once functional in evolutionary time, but they no longer are. So, we're told to eat our 5 fruit a day. If you're in the UK, government guidelines 5 a day, and I'm not sure whether that means 5 apples and oranges or 5 grapes. But that's the advice, because we need our vitamin C. We have to take vitamin C in our diet because we cannot make it. Other organisms can make vitamin C. And if you go mining in the human genome, you can find the enzyme, or rather a corrupted version of the enzyme that would have been useful for making that. It's as though our ancestors, evolutionary, could make vitamin C. We no longer needed to make it because of our diet was such that we could take it in. So we lost the ability, the mutation for that gene came in, and we didn't cause us any harm because we were taking vitamin C in from the diet. But if you hunt in the genome, you can find what's called a pseudogene. It's related to that, it's not expressed, it doesn't make the protein or the enzyme, but it's there in the genome. Evidence again that there are connectedness with other parts of nature. Those are just a couple of examples based on the molecular aspects of looking at different organisms. Now let's just for a moment take a step aside and look at some of the common, if you like, streetwise objections to evolution. Firstly, people will say it's only a theory. And we need to be clear what we mean by theory. And the scientist's view of a theory is not the same as the man in the street, when a theory means a hunch, a good idea. Something I had between breakfast and coffee this morning that'll probably be gone by the time we get to tea time. It's not a hunch. Science starts with a hypothesis. The hypothesis, you would test that by gathering data. You then explain the data. From that explanation, you will get some form of a law that's specific to that particular thing that you're looking at. Beyond that, something that collects lots of laws together would be a theory. So a theory in scientific terms is an overarching explanation. It's a paradigm almost, something that's almost at the top of the scientific tree. It's not a hunch. Secondly, people say, well, it all happened in the past. How can we tell what happened 1 million years ago, let alone 100 million years ago? Did it all happen in the past? Can we observe evolution now? And there are plenty of examples of this. Let me just give you 2 that are a little eye-catching. Here are 2 dogs, right? A rather large one and a rather small one. Selective breeding has achieved those 2. Now, to all functional purposes, those 2 are different species. Species is defined as something that can't interbreed. On pure mechanical basis, those 2 are unlikely to breed. There's also an instance of a mosquito, which is found only in undergrounds. think first discovered in the London Underground, but you find it actually in other underground networks across the world. And it appears that the original mosquito, which is used to living above ground in cooler environments, now lives underground in what the London Underground anyway is always about 1 million degrees too hot for me. And this is adapted to living in that particular environment. So this is a speciation must have occurred after the 1880s. So it's a recent example of that. And there are other examples that we can cite as well. So the fact that it all happened in the past, a lot of the big things did, but we can see things happening today. People say, well, it doesn't make any predictions. Science itself should predict something. Well, it does make predictions that we can test against the data. Species living in the remote past should be different from those living today. And they are. There are some organisms that have a very long history. You can find, for instance, the coelacanth, many tens of millions of years ago. But generally speaking, the organisms that were at present tens of millions ago were different to those today. Simple organisms should generally occur in the oldest strata, and more complex things should occur in the newer strata, the younger, and we see that. And there shouldn't be fossils out of place. Haldane was once asked what would disprove evolution, and replied, a fossil of a rabbit in the Precambrian. In other words, you don't find things out of place in the fossil record. So all of those predictions, one after another, you can put ticks by them. The predictions of what would have occurred in the past. People say, well, there are gaps in the fossil record. It's not continuous. And I emphasize the fossil record is only a small aspect of evidence for evolution. Look at this for a moment. So we believe that birds are descended from dinosaurs and amphibians are descended from fish. So people say, well, there's a gap in the middle there. Is there a link between that? The fossil record's not complete. Well, we discover more things. Particularly recently, this thing called the fuzzy raptor, discovered I think in the just after the turn of the century, which is a feathered species of dinosaur. It probably didn't fly. The feathers were probably there more for insulation than for flight. And this species here, Tiktaalik, which seems to fill the gap between fish and amphibians. So as we discover more fossils, so the gaps begin to be filled. Now, of course, the skeptic now will say, well, you had one gap and now you've got two. But it begins to emphasize the continuum of the biological realm. And the final one, which I'm not going to spend any time on at all, really, is the people who say, well, if we're descended from monkeys, why are there still monkeys around today? And to ask that question actually says a misunderstanding of the whole evolution and biology. It isn't that it's a linear descent, us to monkeys. We have a common ancestor, and that various portions of that are adapted to live in different environments. There's no reason why monkeys shouldn't exist, or any other biological organism. Natural selection is a chance process, it would be a quotation. And you see this, and I think this was Fred Hoyle that said that originally. A complex machine like a Boeing 747 couldn't be constructed by a tornado going through a junkyard. That's not the way in which evolution works. It doesn't start from nothing and get something very complicated immediately. It's a very slow process, as Richard Dawkins, I think, has eloquently expounded in his book, Climbing Mount Improbable. You don't get to the top of a mountain, usually, unless you're a mountaineer. You don't go by the steepest route. You take the long detour that slowly winds its way around the mountain as we go from very simple things through to more complicated things. Mutation itself is a chance process. Evolution requires that there are differences between organisms, differences at the level of their genomes and their DNA. And that those differences are caused by mutations. And mutation is a chance process. It happens by pure chemical mechanisms, but you could not predict where mutations occur, at least at a simple level you can't predict. But the process then of selecting which of those mutations will survive is not random. That itself is dictated by the environment in which the mutations occur. It's also worth remembering that evolution itself is not goal-oriented. It's not random, but organisms cannot look ahead to say, we must do that in order to survive. The mutation arrives first, and then the environment selects the survival. To look ahead is rather Lamarckian of deciding, I need to get to the top of the tallest tree, so I will get a longest neck. That's not evolution. It cannot predict in advance where it's going to go. So that's a very quick overview of one or two aspects of evolution, the scientific part. What are some religious responses to it? I want to quickly look at 4 responses. One says that it inevitably leads to atheism. One is the complete opposite, that evolution must be wrong. It's all young earth creationism. I'll look briefly at intelligent design, and finally theistic evolution, and you won't be surprised to see that we're heading towards involving a complex argument, so that I think that will be the correct one at the end of the day. So let's look at these one at a time. Many people would think that evolution inevitably leads to atheism. And of course, for those who are atheists, they're quite happy with that. For those who are theists, of course, that's a problem if there's an equal sign between those two. Rather strangely, these two characters, Richard Dawkins, well-known popularizer of science, a well-known atheist, and Ken Ham, probably less well-known, is one of the directors of the creation research that you find in Kentucky, with the museums that so say have humans walking with dinosaurs. They come from poles apart. One is at the very young earth end of the spectrum, and the other is at the new atheist end of the spectrum. Yet they would agree that evolution equals atheism. Ken Ham sees that equality, and therefore feels that threatens his faith, and therefore it cannot be compatible. Is that the case, though? Does the fact that we understand a mechanism by which something happened exclude the possibility of a God behind that? So God would be the creator, irrespective of whether I understand how he did the creative process. The scientist's job is to understand the mechanisms, but that doesn't in any way rule out the possibility that there is a mind behind the mechanisms. Evolution itself does not lead to atheism. There are many people who have said that over the past 150 years. If anything, it leads to agnosticism. It itself is silent about the presence or absence of a God. So Huxley was the one who coined the word agnosticism, to say that it's the essence. Sorry, let me read this through. An agnostic denotes people who confess themselves ignorant concerning a variety of matters about which metaphysicians and theologians, both orthodox and heterodox, dogmatize with utmost confidence. Agnosticism, he said, is of the essence of science, whether ancient or modern. It simply means that a man shall not say he knows or believes that which he has no scientific grounds for professing to know or believe. Science itself is silent about the existence or non-existence of God. Coming more recent, Stephen Jay Gould wrote many excellent books on evolution, famous for saying, to say it for all my colleagues and for the umpteenth millionth time, science simply cannot, by its legitimate methods, adjudicate the issue of God's possible superintendence of nature. We neither affirm nor deny it. We simply cannot comment on it as scientists. And he goes on, either half my colleagues are enormously stupid, or else the science of Darwinism is fully compatible with conventional religious beliefs and equally compatible with atheism. Evolution itself says nothing for or against the existence of God. Well, let's take this just a little bit further. Here's another quote from Richard Dawkins. So, the universe that we observe, he says, has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. Now, he may or may not be right in saying that, But unpick these phrases one at a time. No design, well, okay, we might possibly give him that one. No purpose, now I don't know what a scientist is talking about teleology and purpose. No evil, no good, and I don't know what grounds he has for saying that either. Nothing but pitiless indifference. Now that, I think, is his gloss, his interpretation thing. I don't think it's necessary. He goes on then to say, what worries me about religion is it teaches people to be satisfied with not understanding. I think that comes at the base of what he's saying. And the very existence of things like the Faraday Institute and the fact that you are all here today says that I think that statement is evidently false. People are very keen to understand at the scientific and the religious level. Underpinning some of that is not the question of mechanisms, but some of the other things that we're going to look at with other speakers over the next couple of days. So the question of suffering. The evolutionary process inevitably involves death. It involves struggle. And that raises the whole issue of suffering and a purposeful God of love. Darwin himself noted that. What advantage can there be in the sufferings of millions of the lower animals throughout almost endless time? This very old argument from the existence of suffering against the existence of an intelligent first cause seems to me to be a strong one, whereas the presence of much suffering agrees well with the view that all organic beings have been developed through variation and natural selection. So we have to have a theology or theodicy that deals with that suffering aspect that is inevitably part of the evolutionary process. And again, David Hull, writing more recently again in Nature, talks about the kind of God that he thinks is implied by the evolutionary process. He says he's not the God, the Protestant God of waste not, want not. I don't actually read that in the Protestant scriptures. But he's also not the loving God who cares about his productions. The God of the Galapagos, this is David Hull speaking, is careless, wasteful, indifferent, almost diabolical. He's certainly not the sort of God to whom one would be inclined to pray. Now, I'm going to disagree with what David Hull says, but that is some of the reasons why people find evolution difficult to come to terms with, because it inevitably involves some degree of suffering. And death. And let me just give a quick heads up on a few of them and leave it to other speakers to answer the awkward questions. The scriptures are more concerned with spiritual death, separation from God, rather than physical death. Physical death itself does not have to be equated with evil. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. And we need to be careful as we apply moral rules and precepts that we don't take what is very human and apply it to the rest of the created order and assume that a cat playing with a mouse has the same moral implications as me torturing a mouse just for fun. We are human with specific moral responsibilities. A cat is a cat with very different moral responsibilities. Was it possible that evolution was the only way in which a God could have made a complex biological order at the same time as giving us some form of free will, and was suffering inevitable within that? And there's some thoughts for Leibniz that are relevant to this. So that's, if you like, the evolution equals atheism. A few thoughts on that. What about the other end of the spectrum? Evolution must be wrong. We believe in the existence of a creator who did things in 6 days. The Genesis account particularly is literally true. And there are a number of organizations that support that view. The Earth is therefore only about 6,000 to 10,000 years old. Taking some of the blame for this, in popular understanding, is Bishop Ussher in the 16th and 17th century, calculating that the Earth creation happened in 4004 BC by adding together the various genealogical dates in the book of Genesis. I don't think we should be too hard on Bishop Ussher, actually, because some of his reasons for doing that calculation were very well motivated. he was reacting against a more Aristotelian philosophy that said everything always had been and had never changed. And he was demonstrating actually that there was a beginning. It wasn't a perpetual universe. This idea is based on a literal reading of the Genesis text, and I look forward to hearing Ernest Lucas speaking later today to give us better insights into those first 3 chapters. You have to say that until the 19th century, whether it was a literal or a non-literal interpretation was really an unasked question. It was assumed. But by the end of the 19th century, most Christian leaders had come to accept evolution, including those who are now classed as fundamentalists. Part of their fundamentals of faith was not an understanding of a literal interpretation of the first 3 chapters of Genesis. And Ron Numbers, who has also spoken at the Faraday a couple of times, I think, has written very eloquently about the history of the whole creationist movement. Well, the advantages of creationism is actually it makes reading the first 3 chapters of Genesis extremely easy. The disadvantages, I think, is absolutely everything else. Because there is no scientific evidence that the Earth is only a few thousand years old, and all such claims are scientifically, and I emphasize the word scientifically in that context, false. Those who hold that position take a different worldview to the one that I take. Their worldview says that Scripture has the highest authority, and that their interpretation of Scripture must therefore trump every other interpretation, every other worldview and authority. So science may point to the fact that the Earth is very old and that there's an interrelationship between the various biological organisms. Science may say that, but their authority, they say, is higher than that. So it's the trump card. It's the one that says, well, I've got a better argument than your argument, even though your argument's quite good. So we need to understand the worldview that they're coming from. Scientifically, it's an odd way of arguing. Most scientists would try to look at the data and say, what hypothesis can I draw from the data? That's the honest way in which a scientist should behave. This would be something that says, here are the conclusions. What data can I find that match those conclusions? And that's not the way a scientist works. In the lab sometimes, to be honest, sometimes scientists are tempted to do that sort of thing. But we should be starting with the data and drawing conclusions from it. You'll find as you talk to young Earth creationists, they come up with a number of so-called unanswered questions about the world and about biology. You'll find out questions about the dust on the moon and the salt in the sea and the Earth's magnetic field. Those are red herrings. If you're troubled by any of those and you don't know how to answer them, come and see me afterwards and we'll have a little bit of a tutorial on that. It's interesting also that many who adopt that position also are global warming deniers. I don't know why there's that correlation. Maybe somebody can explain that to me, but it's worth noting. And there's often an emphasis on the miraculous. Those who adopt that position will have to say that the world only appears to be old. There only appears to be a connectedness between biological organisms. Actually, they're not. And there's a rather interesting book written by Philip Goss in the middle 19th century called Omphalos. Omphalos is the Greek word for navel, your belly button, with an argument of did Adam have a belly button? Because if he did, it assumed that he had a mother, and at some stage it was attached by an umbilical cord. But of course we know that Adam didn't have a mother, so did he or did he not have a belly button? I'll leave you to think of that little conundrum. If science says that the world is old and that evolution is the mechanism, and that that's only an appearance, what does that say about any God? Is God a deceiver who gives the impression that the world is a different way to the way in which it actually is? So Kingsley, again in the 19th century, says, I cannot believe that God has written on the rocks one enormous and superfluous lie for all mankind. If the rocks are just there to deceive us, what does that say about any form of God? And actually an argument comes down to saying that God created the whole universe this morning, along with you and me, along with our memories of yesterday and our memories of what we had for breakfast, which wasn't a reality, it's just an illusion. We need to look, and I'm sure Ernest will do so, is what do the scriptures teach us? Are they teaching us science, or are they teaching us more about our own position in the universe and about God? Intelligent design, we could go on for a long time about that. I think I'm going to skip quite a number of slides about that. Let me just give you a heads up for those who haven't come across intelligent design before. This is basically the idea that was touched on in the discussion last night, that certain features of the universe can only be explained by an intelligent cause and not by natural selection. It's just too complicated. There is no mechanism of going from A to C because B itself would be unstable and impossible. And some of the major proponents of this, William Dembski, who was a philosopher, sorry, Michael Behe is a biochemist, and Philip Johnson is a lawyer, so be aware of their backgrounds as they argue. And probably the best known book in this is Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box. It's related a little bit, excuse me, to William Paley and his arguments before Darwin for design of finding a watch in a forest and saying this is just too complicated to have come there by chance. There must be a designer of the watch. There must be a purpose to it all. And those who follow irreducible complexity and intelligent design will often use the mousetrap as an example. That this is a complicated device which fits together to trap mice. And that how could that have evolved? Without any one part of that, it doesn't function as a mousetrap, does it? A mousetrap without a spring will just be a cheese board for a mouse. So that the argument is that this is very complicated. It must have all come together as one designed entity rather than evolve. I actually take issue with that because I could find lots of uses for all the various bits and pieces of that. That the bar across there, I could use that as a toothpick. The block it's on would do quite nicely as a doorstop. All sorts of uses for various components of that. So it may not have been a mousetrap before, but the various components would have had some use. And biology is rather like me doing DIY. I'm hopeless at DIY, and I've never got the right tools to do the job. And so I always make do. A bit of this, a piece of wood from there, a nail from here, a screw from there, a roughly cut thing with a saw, and it does the job. And that's effectively what biology is doing all the time in evolution. Not looking ahead and designing something that perfectly matches, but taking components that may have all sorts of different functions and bringing them together so as to create function. Biology is extremely resourceful. It's like me doing DIY. It reuses components in all sorts of different ways. And simply saying that a miracle occurs in the middle of a pathway is not a very scientific explanation. So those who follow ID will take particular biochemical examples, the bacterial flagellum, the blood clotting cascade, the immune system, etc., etc., etc. And they'll keep throwing up other examples of irreducibly complex systems. I think those are an extremely good foil. I think them raising that has caused evolutionary biologists and molecular biologists and biochemists to think through what are the mechanisms that these things that could have caused these things to originate. Let's just look at one example. So the bacterial flagellum, this, if you like, is the tail, the motor, the outboard motor on a bacterium. It's a very complicated structure. It's made of many, many different proteins that has to be anchored to a membrane. It has to have a system of transducing chemical energy into mechanical energy. It's then going to have this sort of rotating blade that goes around. It is a remarkably complicated system. How is it too complicated to have evolved? Well, if we look at the various components of this, and they all carry these rather strange names that biochemists have a habit of giving molecular components, you find all sorts of other examples of them in other biochemical machines. So whether it's mechanisms for injecting toxins into cells, whether it's the mechanism for making ATP, that's the energy source of the cell, there are similarities between these things. So that, and here's an article taken from Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of USA back in 2007. This is the abstract of this, where they're looking at could the bacterial flagellum have evolved. And I've just highlighted at the bottom here, these results show that the core components of the bacterial flagellum originated through the successive duplication and modification of a few, or perhaps even a single precursor gene. Now, there is a mechanism for explaining it. And that's not to say that this is the mechanism, it may not be correct, but there is a plausible mechanism for how that could have arisen. Is intelligent design science? Well, there was a famous court case a few years ago in Dover in the USA, an argument between a school and the local people over whether intelligent design should be taught or not. And the court adjudication said that we find that while ID arguments may be true, and that's a maybe, a proposition on which the court takes no position, ID is not science. So it possibly could maybe be theologically true. It violates, as they put it, the centuries-old ground rules of science by invoking and permitting supernatural causation. Science is to do with finding out how things have happened, and to simply say we don't understand, therefore a miracle occurs, is clearly not science. I'm going to skip over some of these. We could talk about ID at length. It's essentially a form of the God of the Gaps argument. Two consequences of that, if we accept intelligent design, it actually says that we should then be fearful of scientific discoveries. If we have said, for instance, that the bacterial flagellum is irreducibly complex and is evidence of the designer, it says to the theist, do not look any further. Because if you do look further and you find a mechanism, you've ruled God out of the equation. So it can gender a fear of further scientific discoveries. And it also is unscientific because it says that certain aspects of the physical and the biological world will never yield their secrets because that's in God's domain, and anything in God's domain must be inexplicable and mysterious and happens by some form of magic rather than by any sort of understandable scientific mechanism. Where science is clearly concerned with understanding with things we don't know. That's what makes science fun. I am a practicing scientist. I do get into the lab, don't just administer things every day, although the university requires more of that of me. It's fun being in the lab. That's what makes science really exciting, is discovering new things. And simply to put a bar down that says we don't understand, there goes God, it's a scientific stopper. I rather like this quote from Charles Coulson, who was Professor of Theoretical Chemistry in Oxford, who said, when we come to the scientifically unknown, our correct policy is not to rejoice because we have found God, it is to become better scientists. Get back in the lab if you don't understand something. So I'd argue that actually intelligent design is not good theology. It doesn't necessarily point to God's action in creation. It says where we shouldn't go. It actually assumes a backdrop of some things that were not designed, as well as things that were designed. And what's God's involvement in the non-designed processes? The fourth one, which I'm not going to spend so much time on, because I think it's almost too obvious to stay, is theistic evolution. It says there is no mismatch between an evolutionary theory and a belief in a creator God. Evolution was the mechanism that God used in order to bring about biological complexity. It simply says that those two they can sit together side by side. There are lots of questions we still need to ask, but that evolution itself is the mechanism that God used. And this is too complicated to read, but here's something called the Clergy Letter, was produced a few years ago by US clergy people. We the undersigned Christian clergy from many different traditions, believe that the timeless truths of the Bible and the discoveries of modern science may comfortably coexist. We believe that the theory of evolution is a foundational scientific truth, one which is stood up to rigorous scrutiny and upon which much of human knowledge and achievement rests. So they're in no way denying evolution. They're taking it on board and at the same time not denying their religious faith. Here's a letter written on the 150th anniversary of Darwin's birth by some luminaries, one of whom is chairing this session here, asking for a ceasefire between the atheists and the creationists, and saying let's put down those weapons that we keep attacking each other with and just say these are compatible. Evolution does not say there isn't a God, and vice versa. It comes back to some of the some old writings, if you like, that we look at the world through Scripture, and we look at the world through nature, and both of those are ways in which a God has spoken. Two books, Scripture and nature. So Francis Bacon, famous scientist, God, he says, must first be known from nature and afterwards recognized by doctrine. From nature by his works and from doctrine by his revealed words. Both Scripture and nature, God speaking to us through that. And all truth is God's truth. So again, another quotation on this from Archbishop Temple. Evolution, says, touches not on the evidence of design, but the mode in which the design was executed. In one case, the Creator made the animals at once, such as they are. In other words, that's the creationist view. And in the other, he impressed on certain particles of matter such inherent powers that in the ordinary course of time, living creatures were developed. He did not make things, he made them make themselves. That's the evolutionary process. Or as Augustine would have said, nature is what God does. That's the way in which he interacts with the world. Again, somebody like Charles Kingsley. It's just as noble a conception of the deity to believe that he created a few original forms capable of self-development into other and needful forms as to believe they required a fresh act of creation to supply the voids caused by the action of his laws. All God's laws are encompassed within this. So there is no mismatch to many people between an evolution as the mechanism that God used and the existence of a designer behind that evolutionary process. A famous saying in evolution is from Theodosius Dovzyansky, who said this: nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. It's worth just unpicking a little bit more from that article that he wrote back in 1973. And he's very right in the sense that evolution makes biology a science. You might say before Darwin, biology was very much stamp collecting. It was just cataloguing species, putting like I don't know, train spotting almost, saying seen this, seen that, seen the other. Now evolution puts that together into a scientific, rational framework. It's more than just a sundry biological facts, as he put it. But let's read a little bit more about what Dovzyansky put in that article. He is a Russian Orthodox. So he says the organic diversity becomes reasonable and understandable if the Creator has created a living world not by caprice, but by evolution propelled by natural selection. It is wrong to hold creation and evolution as mutually exclusive alternatives. I am a creationist and an evolutionist. Evolution is God's, or nature's, method of creation. Creation is not an event that happened in 4004 BC. It is a process that began 10 billion years ago and is still underway. And he goes on, does evolutionary doctrine clash with religious faith? It does not. It is a blunder to mistake the Holy Scriptures for elementary textbooks of astronomy, geology, biology, and anthropology. And I leave you to read the rest of that. So one of the, if you like, the great quotations of evolution, nothing makes sense in biology except through evolution, is said actually by somebody with a profound religious faith. But why do, let's spend 10 minutes or so at the end, why do some people still feel uncomfortable with evolution? One, as we've looked at, is that people assume that evolution necessarily means atheism, and I hope I've begun to explain I don't think there is a necessary link between those two. The second one is that people sometimes take Darwinism and apply it to other areas of life, and assume that because they don't like that, and it doesn't seem right, that it automatically applies back to biology. So let's look at, that one. And here's an example. This is taken from a magazine called Evangelicals Now. It's a magazine that actually have considerable sympathy with many of the things that are written in this. But this was an article written on the Darwin centenary, and it goes on about the influence that the origin of species have had, and then finishes in the abstract. I think this was: the sanctity of life of the unborn child has been eroded, together with loss of the importance of traditional family structure and sexual morality. Now, you may or may not agree with his analysis of what's happened in society, but he's laying the blame for that straight at Darwin and evolution. I don't see a sequitur between those two, and a link. It's using Darwinism and evolution as the bad boy, whereas they may have happened at the same time, but I don't see a consequential link between those. Here is from Ken Ham's website. He's the creationist museum. So he's got this little cartoon here with abortion, family breakup, homosexual behaviour, racism, pornography, euthanasia, all of which he sees as issues in society. And again, you may or may not agree with his conclusion of that. But the text says, if the church wants to be successful in changing society's attitudes towards, and then that long list again, it's going to have to fight the issue at a foundational level. The foundational basis of evolution needs to be destroyed. Again, is there a link there? These may or may not be problems in society, but is evolution to blame for that? No, he's using that as a bête noire, something that he's making a link that I don't think is there. Those things, if we accept evolution requires atheism, then some of that may be correct. But actually that's a critique of secularism, not a critique of evolution. Another place where people feel uneasy to go is the whole area of social Darwinism. To say that the survival of the fittest is something that also should be part of the society that we live in. So the weak go to the wall because they don't deserve to survive. And maybe Herbert Spencer, again in the 19th century, was the best exponent of that. So a creature not energetic enough to maintain itself must die. And he applied that to society. You might say that the Nazis' final solution as being an example of where Darwinism or evolution or natural selection has been taken into places it should never go. Don't blame Darwin for what some other people have done with his theory. Those are wrong applications. In contrast, we need to be aware actually that most religions teach completely the opposite. They require their followers to defend the weak and support the poor. And that's not an argument against evolution. There are plenty of good evolutionary arguments for altruism and how that might have come about. But to use Darwinism as a means of saying that the poor shall therefore suffer and that we don't care about the weak is actually taking it to a place it shouldn't go. So what do I think are the real issues? And we haven't got any time to explore almost any of these at all. Interpreting scripture, I'm going to leave to Ernest Lucas. The question of suffering I've raised, and we need to have a theology that will encompass that. But that's true whether we accept evolution or not. Suffering has always been one of the problems for any theist. It raises questions of what it means to be human, if we're connected to the rest of the biological order. It asks questions about there are moral implications of evolution. And it comes also to the question of, can we use biology as any proof for the existence of God, and it asks questions about how God interacts with the world. Just in closing, a few slides on a few of those. Are humans special? That's one of the things that, if like people at a gut level react against evolution, is that we're different, aren't we, to the rest of the created order. Well, in terms of the genomics, we're not that different. 98%, it depends how you do the calculations, of our genome is identical to that of chimpanzees. But what a difference that 2% makes. You are sat there very quietly and civilly listening to me, and not scratching around and seeking for bananas. And you're thinking in a way that a chimpanzee wouldn't do. There is a tremendous difference between us. We have the capacity to know right and wrong, to know God or not know God. Now, that's not to say that there are no conscious capacities in chimpanzees, but clearly we're very different. And yet the scriptures talk about God breathing life into Adam and Eve, creating them in his image with the ability to relate to him. We can trace our anatomy, our physiology, our biology back through the generations. And the fossil record for the evolution of humans actually is probably as complete as any other species, if not more so. On the basis of that, it looks as though we're not the result of a special physical act of creation. I emphasize that word, physical. Because actually, is our physical form important at all? Evolution could have taken all sorts of different turns along the way. And we could have ended up with 3 legs. I think there's very good reasons why we didn't, because we probably wouldn't be very efficient at moving around. We could have ended up in a totally different shape. We could have ended up looking like green men from Mars. But that's not the basis of what makes us human, our physiology, our anatomy. There's a deeper level to what makes us human. We are those with the capacity to think and to reason and to relate to God and to know the difference between good and evil. And that's independent of our biology. Questions about design, too, are not new. It doesn't necessarily take the theist to look at nature and have that spine-tingling feeling as you look out at something and say, well, this is amazing, isn't it? The theist looks at the world around and says, it's amazing, I know something about the God who made this. The atheist and the agnostic simply looks at it and still feels a sense of wonder. There's something innocent humans that looks out at nature and says, wow. Because after Darwin, we can no longer say about the biological world that this is wow because God made it specifically to be like that. Things appear to be good because they've evolved to be best fitted to their particular environment. We cannot use biology as a means of proving the existence of God. And I put that word prove in inverted commas. I think it's an improper use of biology to try to do so. So the words of the psalmist or the Job are not evidences of God's existence, but actually declarations from within a position of faith. So the psalmist says, the heavens declare the glory of God. I don't think that's the view of somebody coming to the heavens and looking at them and saying, oh yes, there must be a God. But rather the other way around, as somebody who, by all sorts of other means, has come to the conclusion that there is a God, and now looks up at the heavens and say, this is fully compatible with what I believe about God. Which chicken and egg, which comes first? There is also the question of human origins in terms of who was Adam, and I think we may have some discussion over that later. Final slide, though, is to what contribution has evolution made to our understanding of creation. I think it raises some questions about what sort of a creator we've got. It's not a form of deism. This is a long process. This has occurred over many millions of years. Actually, it's quite awe-inspiring to think how many millions of years it took to get to you and me. Right? That's how long a God has been working throughout the evolutionary process to get to you. It can make you feel very small. It can actually have the opposite and make you feel very, very special. It's taken that far just to get to you. It questions a theodicy. What role has suffering got in theology? It's part of the process. It asks questions about how God operates in the world. Does God operate through a process or by the miraculous? Is it only a God who is evident when something unusual, non-scientific happens? Or is God involved in the mundane, the routine, the physical, the explicable? So, and I forget it was who said this, in one sense evolution re-emphasised God's continuing activity after deism had lost sight of it. It emphasised God's laws of nature, and that's why miracles themselves are actually very rare, because nature goes through law. So some will say the Christian symbol of the fish. I've seen many, I don't know if you've seen the bumper stickers with the takeoff of that, with Darwin in the middle of it, and the fish with a couple of legs. That's the missing link between the fish and the amphibians. And are those two opposed? Well, I also found this on browsing the internet Jesus loves Darwin. The two are not incompatible. A view of creation and a creator and a view of an evolved world are fully compatible, that being the mechanism that God has used. And my final slide says there are far wiser people who've said many things about this topic. Many of those books I think are on the bookstore. Please go and read them as a far better explanation of the whole topic than anything I could ever say. And one of them is our chair, and I hand back to him. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Keith, indeed. Yes, first question.
Hi, a comment and a question. I think you're mischaracterising Richard Dawkins slightly. I don't think he says evolution equals atheism. What he says is that evolution made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. But he's not saying that evolution is incompatible with any conception of God whatsoever. Richard Dawkins would say that on logical grounds evolution is compatible with theism, but he rejects theism not on evolutionary grounds but for other reasons. So that's my first comment.
Can I comment on that as you go through? That's actually very helpful, and you're quite correct in saying that Dawkins' view is that evolution makes it possible for him to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. I think he then develops that argument further and then uses evolution as one of his pins for atheism, as though it's one of the foundations for it. But I understand exactly what you're saying, and you are right.
A supporting argument,
yes, thank
but
you.
the two are not equal. I think that's unfair. My question is evolution compatible with? Is evolution more compatible with Christianity than with other faiths? And if so, in what way?
I hesitate to answer that because I'm not familiar enough with the details of many other faiths. I mean, most of what I've said is equally compatible with the other Abrahamic faiths. So Judaism and Islam. I think they look to the same Genesis scriptures. I hesitate to say whether it's compatible with things like Hinduism or Buddhism. I suspect that it's less compatible with those. They tend to be, and I parody in saying this, they tend to be religions that have less of an emphasis on the physical world anyway. Whereas the Abrahamic faiths are ones that do say that the physical world is good. It's not an escape from that, and therefore it is right to investigate that, and a God could have worked through various physical processes. Clearly a religion that says the world is something to escape from, the world is bad, is not going to be one that's going to see quite so much of God's creative activity going on with that. Now, I speak from a position of ignorance on that, and so I hesitate to say anything further. But I think it's probably more compatible with those Abrahamic faiths than maybe some of the more Eastern religions. But I'm sure there are others who can give far clearer answers on that.
Add one word to that, Keith, perhaps is worth adding. I mean, I don't think it's accidental that Charles Darwin read divinity here in Cambridge. I don't, if you think of the way when you read The Origin of Species, many people have pointed out, it's a bit like reading Peggy. I mean, there's a strong Palian natural theological framework for The Origin of Species that comes through very clearly, and many people have remarked on that. So I think one has to also reflect on the sort of historical roots of where the whole theory of evolution is coming from here as well. That's an interesting discussion.
I mean, Darwin admits that during his undergraduate days he was profoundly influenced by Paleo. It was one of the major stimuli in his undergraduate studies. Right? He came to reject that after the voyage on the Beagle, but during his undergraduate days, profoundly influenced by Paleo.
Yes, yeah.
Just more of a personal testimony kind of question. I was wondering, since you're a biochemist and Vihi is a biochemist, I've been often struck by the fact that biochemists, including those who work with biological molecules, could be vociferous opponents of evolution in our day. I'm less surprised that lawyers and engineers and physicists are, because it's not their bread and butter. But so, speaking as a biochemist, how would you explain that and your difference with Vihi, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, that is a fascinating question, and I have debated with Michael Behe, so we've exchanged friendly fire. I think if you push Michael Behe hard, there may not be a great deal of difference between him and me. The intelligent design is a very, very broad church. Maybe to use a bad turn of phrase. From almost from it includes the creationist right through, almost to theistic evolution. And I asked Michael Behe, okay, so you want an intelligent designer in there. How did the intelligent designer do that? Did they do that by, if you like, a miraculous process of all of a sudden an enzyme appeared as from nowhere? Or did the intelligent designer use a chemical and physical and biological process in order to be able to achieve that? And many of the intelligent designers, and I don't want to put words in Michael Behe's mouth, but I think that's what he says, would actually say that the process the intelligent designer used was one that, if you were there at the time, would have had physical and biological and chemical explanations behind it, which is the biochemist speaking. There was nothing irrational about the process that has happened. It just wasn't something that would have happened in the normal turn of events by an ordinary selection. So I would want to ask the question of the intelligent designer, how did the designer execute that process? And when you start to take it down to that sort of level, if we both agree that if there's a God, then he's intelligent and he's designing things, it's a question of how did he do that? Was it by a natural process, or was it by a direct intervention that something appeared as from nothing? And I think that we may be splitting hairs sometimes when we're talking about those differences. Now, the other end of the intelligent design argument is not where people like Michael Behe go. That is towards the end of the creationist argument that says everything happened really by God doing a big zap, as from nothing comes something now, and all sorts of steps along the way. Let's ramble a little bit around your question. Michael Behe's actually background is even closer to mine. We're both nucleic acid biochemists, so we both fiddle with DNA. I cannot explain why he comes to a different conclusion than mine. There goes life.
I mean, just to comment on Keith's point there about ID being a broad church, I took part in a debate in Dallas, Texas, a little over a year ago on intelligent design. It was hosted by an Episcopalian church, and there were two of us critiquing ID. I had one of them. My colleague was Lawrence Krauss, who's an atheist, and the two people defending ID, one was agnostic and one was atheist. Okay, so I was the only Christian in this discussion about intelligent design in Dallas, Texas, hosted by an Episcopalian church. It's just to reflect. This is a fairly confusing kind of broad church. I mean, it's you can't easily just pin everything down. Yes.
Can I pick up one other point that you mentioned actually just in passing? You understand why a lawyer and an engineer might come to a different conclusion, and I think that's worth bearing in mind, that lawyers do look at things differently. Lawyers want to have every single step in the argument complete, and if it's not, then the legal case falls apart. Whereas a scientist is quite happy to wave their arm and say, I don't know. This is just the way the world is, and I'm going to see if I can find out.
Yes. Okay, at the back, please, and then we'll come forward. Yes.
Yes, you were talking about microbeating and asking about how the cell first was put together. I'm not scientist. But how can also can evolutionary biology, specifically Darwinian, explain the same thing?
Sorry, do you want to
The
repeat
origin
that?
of it, how it became.
So, how does regular science, what's the scientific mainstream view of how the cell comes into being, such a complex entity?
Oh, the origin of life.
The origin of the first cell, that's an easy question.
That is, yes, that is something that science really, I think, has no authoritative answer to. Evolution as a process really talks about how things have evolved, granted that we've started with life. Now, scientists have very good ideas about how life might have emerged, whether it's from inorganic things, clustering and organising organic things around them, whether it's the RNA world as another possibility. Those are, I think, scientific speculations. And I'm fully in favour of scientists speculating, testing things, trying things out. I suspect that actually we will never know the actual origin of life. It may well have been a fluke event, you know? A 1 in a billion chance that something happened. I don't know. We may never know. But I think we do need to separate evolution from the origin of life. They're actually asking slightly different questions. One I think science can answer and address. The other one we can speculate on, but there may never be a definitive answer.
Well, there's some quite good data. I mean, you don't know. I mean, when you look in the literature, you know, there's quite a good literature on the origin of life sort of stuff. You know, it's incomplete by miles.
It's very incomplete, and actually
yeah.
some of it incompatible with each other. But then whether we talk about, you know, the origin of proteins and of amino acids and the Muller experiment, I still think the question of how did that first cell come together as a complex DNA, RNA, protein inside a membrane is one that I think science is struggling to answer. It's got some ideas.
Question here, please. Yes.
I have a comment and question. Since you mentioned interpreting scriptures, there is a book by Professor Aviezer from Israel who developed quite elegant system of explaining evolution in terms of traditional Judaism, because he considers 7 stages of evolution symbolically rather than 7 days. And he supports it by fossils, illustrations, and it's a very nice book. It's translated in many languages and it's available in English. And my question is, I have difficulty in understanding evolution of whales. I understand they're mammals, and they evolved from some land, tiny mouse-like mammals. How did they manage to decide to go back to water, and how they evolved from mouse to whales? I don't understand it exactly.
To take your first comment, I'm not aware of that book, but it does sound interesting. Many people are trying to take that Genesis account and say, does it match with the evolutionary process? And in a very broad brush, it could be said that it also goes from the simple to the complicated. In detail, it doesn't match because things are in the wrong order, so that you get light after the presence of plants. Ernest Lucas would be able to tell you far more about those things than I can.
But
Your detail.
he also questions these discrepancies in terms of dating, and he assumes that maybe these contradictions are due to our current imperfect dating. So maybe this is in fact was more gradual and harmonious. And
Okay.
it's his argument.
I need to read the book.
Yeah.
Your detailed question about the origin of whales, I'm not that sort of biologist, maybe good at the explanation.
Yeah.
But remember, you used the words decided to go back. There was no decision amongst it. It wasn't a conscious process.
Yeah.
It would have been that the environment that they were living in would have favoured those organisms that were then better adapted to going back to living in the water, even though they'd come from mammals that were on land.
So it's just possible that evolution during millions of years pushed some initial creature with a very small length and minimal capacity of staying without breathing, pushed into such a developed system. It's quite possible from your view.
Yes, I hesitate you use the word push, but I think, yes, favoured those that had the properties to be able to survive in that other environment, yes.
There's a book by Neil Shubin called Your Inner Whale,
There is, yes.
which I recommend. Your Inner Whale. So, 1 out of 500, I mean, actually, baleen whales have still the little hind leg, very small. If you go to a natural history museum, you see this huge, great baleen whale skeleton, and then hanging separately with a little wire, if there's a good museum, will be the little hind leg, which it doesn't need, and it's completely detached from the skeleton. So it's a fascinating evidence for evolution as a vestige.
Legs are not problem, but lungs.
Yeah, well, please question, Ben, yeah. So.
If you're able to offer some thoughts about this, even if they're tentative thoughts, I wonder what your opinion was on the contrast between the discourse and discussion about this in the USA and the UK, and what are the main differences and why those differences exist. And just as a contributing thought to that, I was interested that you pointed out how there's also the denial of global warming by kind of the young Earth creationist position. And certainly I haven't kind of seen enough evidence to be able to say something concrete, but from what I can tell, it seems like the young Earth creationist position often goes in a kind of socially conservative package that includes a lot of other hot button issues, and is part of a bigger social, political and economic scenario that has developed in the USA.
Yes, I mean, maybe take the second part of that first of all, is I think it does come with a certain worldview that maybe if the world is only 6,000 years old, and if God is going to bring it to its completion in the near future, then why bother? So I think that's why the two go hand in hand. If the Earth is billions of years old, then it's got billions of years to come, possibly, and we need to be taking care of it. If it's only 6,000 years old and God's going to bring it to completion fairly soon, then why bother? So I think that's the link with the global warming. Your question as to whether there is a difference between the US and the UK, my American colleagues, I'm sure, can give a far better explanation of why that may be. I think in part it may be a reaction against the separation between church and state in the US that we don't have in the UK, and the teaching of religion in schools. So ID, I think, is one way of trying to sneak God into the education agenda in the US, whereas the education in the UK is very different. There are other ways in which God is taught. Now, increasingly, I do see that the tone of the argument is changing in the UK. I think there are increasing numbers of people, particularly in the evangelical tradition that I come from, who are more accepting of creationism and ID. I don't know why that should be the case. Maybe because we as Brits nearly always follow what the Americans do 10 or 20 years previously. We're not very good at inventing our own silly ideas. But I think in schools and in churches I'm seeing more, maybe it's because I'm more sensitive to it, I am seeing more of that, if you like, extreme creationism in the UK. It saddens me. I don't know why it should be, but I value anybody else's interpretation of it.
Okay, there's a lot of hands going up here. We should come over this side. Yes? And so I think actually the lady behind you has had a hand on for quite a long time, so can we start with you? Thank you. So.
It's more of a comment than a question, really, but just in response to people who would say that evolution is all in the past. We don't see it happening now. Actually, we see it happening every time somebody gets cancer, because cancer is an evolutionary process. It's just one that's going on. The cells within our body are evolving and growing too fast. But it's the same. It's exactly the same mechanism. Cancer is a microevolutionary process, so we see it all the time. It's happening to 1 in 3 of us.
Yes, and that's all to do with mutations, and that mutations happen, and give cancerous growths in 30% of the population. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes. Okay, yes, then I'll come to in front of you. Yes. Yeah.
Sorry, you said that
Oh, yes. Okay, fine.
you said that evolution is not goal orientated, but Dawkins definitely thinks it is. Would you agree?
I don't think Dawkins would say it's goal-oriented. It doesn't know where it's going, evolution does. It simply has to, species adapt according to the environment that they're in. When I say goal-oriented, it isn't as though an organism to decide, well, there's water out there, so I better adapt in order to be able to swim in the water. Or the temperature of the earth is rising, so I better adapt in order to be able to fit in with that. Is that evolution takes those mutations that are better adapted to those changes in environment and uses them, rather than it being, if you like, a necessity. It may well be that there are environments in which no mutation could ever give rise to an organism that could live within that. So the fact that there is a goal to get there doesn't necessarily mean it's not conscious. It can't decide it's going in any particular direction. It just happens. I don't think Dawkins would disagree. I see.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is that a lot of evolution skeptics think that evolution is a random process. It's not a random process. It's a non-random survival of random variation.
Yes.
It's not goal-orientated. There's not a foredecided goal to which organisms are trying to reach.
Yeah, thank you, and that's what I'm trying to convey, is that the mutation process itself is random, but the selection is not. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think it's fair to say Dawkins is a moderate progressionist, actually. If you look at his review of Stephen Jay Gould, and I mean, he's a long way from Gould on that. He's much more of the progressionist side of the spectrum than somebody like Gould would be, I think. I think we'll go to people who ask questions first. Yes, thank you. Yes.
I was interested in your point earlier, and it reflects also what Charles Kingsley was saying about whether evolution leads to deism. You said that it probably doesn't. I suspect that it's probably myself, I suspect that it's probably a more natural conclusion to go to deism rather than theism if you take an evolution serious. So, for example, if you're going to suggest seriously that God sets a set of parameters and then sort of lets the ball go rolling and then sort of divorces himself from creation. Of course, a theist would want to say that God is continually involved in creation. I think that's a further step. I just suspect the natural step is to go to deism, and I wondered.
Yes, I mean, what I was arguing against, if you like, is a mechanistic view of the world that maybe comes from the early 18th and 19th century, which would have taken the God had created the world in 6 days, and on the 7th day he rested, and then from then on we're in the 7th day and nothing else to do. So that God had done all his work in those first 6 days, and beyond that there is nothing for God to need to do, because the world's already functioning perfectly well, thank you. Whereas for a theist, that everything is happening over a long period of time and it's fully compatible with a God who is involved, upholding the universe at every step along the way. Now, I'm not saying that evolution necessarily says that takes you to a theist perspective, but I think it's as compatible with that as it is with a deism of a God who, if like, sets the first organism going and then just steps back and walks away from it and waits for whatever happens. If you take certainly the Christian position that we as humans are made in God's image for some form of relationship with him and some knowledge of the difference between good and evil, then the process itself, the fact that we have come at the end of that process, is actually important, and that God intimately involved in every step along the way and upholding the whole universe is fully then compatible with an evolutionary perspective. Does that answer your question? Look on your faces, I'm not.
I just wonder whether God has to be involved at every step of the way in the evolutionary process.
I don't think you would have to say that God must be involved in every step along the way. To somebody who comes to it from a theist, and particularly in my perspective, Christian position, then there is no incompatibility with God being involved, upholding the universe at every step along the way. And that's not to say he's tinkering with every single molecular interaction at every point on the evolutionary scale. I think there is some contingency in the whole process. But that God, nonetheless, is upholding the whole process.
Interesting to read Aubrey Moore, late 19th century Anglo-Catholic director of the Oxford Botanical Gardens, who wrote a whole book about this, and who welcomed Darwinism because he felt that it counteracted the deism that he saw implicit in Paley's natural theology. And so he had a very strong immanentist view of God's action in the world. So it's quite interesting. He wrote a whole book about this, actually, which is out of print, but still around. And yeah, so I just mentioned that name. Yes. We have time for one or two more questions.
Could you repeat the name?
Aubrey Moore. Aubrey Moore. M-O-M-O-R-E. If you Google him, he was at St John's Coast, fellow at St John's College in Oxford, 1880s. He wrote a book called something Mundi.
Lux Mundi.
Lux. The light of, yes, thank you, Latin speakers here help us. Lux Mundi is the name of his book. We have time, I think, for one more question. We're obviously going to be coming back to a lot of these. Some who hasn't asked a question yet. I think we have to give priority to a few other hands. Oh, yes, please, yes.
One of the issues in the whole public debate goes back to your comment about both sides saying that evolution equals atheism with the provisos of that. A lot of associations for the advancement of science have programs to deal with creationism. There doesn't seem to be programs to deal with the flip side, that the associations do not slap down those who say that evolution equals atheism. So it seems asymmetric, and that may be a problem in the public persona.
You're right in a sense, except that many of the creationist views are actually arguing against science, which is why I think they have to have statements that are very clear in that way, that defend scientific understanding as we know it. I've somewhere on my computer there is the AAS statement on creationism and evolution, and my recollection of that is quite clear that it makes no statement about the existence or non-existence of a God. It's not even just implicit, I think it is explicit that that their statements are defending science and not in any way attacking religion, as the two are compatible.
Okay, is it a real quick one?
It seems to me that is fast becoming an establishment scientific view that atheism is necessary. For instance, the editorial position of New Scientist, for instance, now seems to be taking that line on every opportunity. I'm worried about that because it's becoming part of the scientific package, which isn't fair or right.
I think I agree with you that there is but it's not just science actually, it is in every other aspect of life, an increasing secularism. And I think it's just reflected in the kind of people that we see editing journals like Science and Nature and New Scientist, whatever it might be. They come from a secular background, and I think it's just a reflection on that.
Well, with that thought, I think we'll thank Keith very much for getting us off to a flying start today. Thank you.